Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth and final program in the Life and Death Decisions series hosted by the Men's Club of Temple Beth Shalom. Special thanks to Rabbi Ed Weinsberg for his leadership in the programming department, and also to Elliot Korn and Joel Servitz for their technical expertise. And with that, I pass the baton over to Rabbi Ed.
Thanks very much, Marshall. And again, thank you to the other gentleman you mentioned earlier for your technical proficiency. As I have dubbed you all Zoom Masters of Temple Beth Shalom. We all appreciate that. It makes such a difference in this era of COVID. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Rabbi Stuart Altshuler. He's not new to most of you because he's been with us. It seemed like a year, but it's only a few months, which is kind of incredible. All of us have come immediately to appreciate his charm, his erudition, and his goodwill to so many people. So I got to publicly thank you at least once, right, in the course of our connection together. Rabbi Altschuler received his Bachelor of Arts from the University of California at Berkeley and was ordained as a conservative rabbi at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1980, followed by his getting a doctorate in history at the JTS in 2002. He served several other congregations in the course of his service to the rabbinate, both in England, most recently in London, and in California, Illinois, Virginia, and Connecticut. So we might say he has literally been around. He has also been quite active in the general Jewish community in terms of his involvement with the Rabbinical Assembly and his support for AIPAC in all of the communities that he was involved. Most importantly, probably, he's been married to Ella for 26 years. And we are thankful that she finally reached these shores just this past weekend or so. So welcome, I guess, officially to both of you. And here's Rabbi Altschuler.
All right. Thank you so much. My colleague, Rabbi Ed, thank you for the introduction, Marshall, and Al, our chairman, and everyone who makes this possible. Well, after we're going to be discussing Jewish views of the afterlife. First of all, if I had any definitive answer to all this, and I could guarantee everybody, we're going on to the world to come, I would be one wealthy rabbi. But I I don't have all the answers with this, and that's essentially the Jewish response. But let me share some various views here. And I'm going to begin with this episode based upon a Midrash loosely from a Rabbi Yechiel Michael Tukashinsky. I don't know who he is, but what he wrote has become popular. And it goes like this. In many ways, it does express a Jewish view, a traditional Jewish view. There are a pair of twins in a mother's womb. They're in the womb, they're happy, they're warm, all their needs are taken care of, they're fed, they have water, they have everything you could possibly imagine in this paradise in their mother's womb. And then after 9 months of this beautiful existence, all of a sudden, one day, their world gets completely turned upside down. They start spinning upside down. Everything is falling apart in their beautiful world in the womb. And there's two of them there. It can be a boy and boy, boy and girl, whatever. And one of them is a believer and one is a skeptic. So the believer is saying, listen, we've had it so good the past 9 months, even though it looks horrible right now, I've got to believe that there's light at the end of the tunnel. There's got to be a reason for this. And then there's the skeptic who says, oh, you got it all wrong. Our world's coming to an end. It's all doom. It was too good to be true. You are absolutely Pollyannish. You are naive. Everything's coming to an end. We've had this existence. I'm very grateful, but go like this is beyond comprehension. It's all coming to an end. And they're spitting and it's horrible. And they're arguing about whether this is a good thing, maybe there's something great at the end or something that's not. And finally, they go up this tube passageway and there's a light at the end of the tunnel and they emerge out of the mother's womb and they hear Mazel Tov and they're embraced by a mother and a father. Who else is in the room? You know, in the old days when my mother was born in a barn in Romania, the whole mishpacha was there that left Ukraine to come to the country. So you can imagine there's a whole bunch of people saying Mazel Tov, and maybe the one deliverer whacks the both of them. You have twins, Mazel Tov. So the believer was proven to be correct. And that is that they emerged into an existence they couldn't imagine. That episode's interesting. You know, it is obviously based upon a way for us to deal with a reality that is true. We don't know the unknown. We never will know in this life. I've never met anybody who has passed from this world and could tell us about it. Nobody has had that opportunity. But in many ways, there is definitely a traditional Jewish belief that the believer is right, that there's a continuation of some kind that we cannot imagine. Let me also share this view. This was written by a prominent scientist 50, 60 years ago. Very well-known, Sir Werner von Braun, who helped us with the rocket program in the 50s and 60s after the war. Controversial figure, but he wrote the following about science and belief in the afterlife. He wrote, science has a real surprise for the skeptics. Science, for instance, tells us that nothing in nature, not even the tiniest particle, can disappear without a trace. Nature does not know extinction. All it knows is transformation. Now, if God applies this fundamental principle to the most minute and insignificant parts of his universe, doesn't it make sense to assume he applies it also to the human soul? I think it does. And everything science has taught me and continues to teach me strengthens my belief in the continuity of our spiritual existence after death. Nothing disappears without a trace. Now, that's a view from someone who is completely immersed in science, rational thought. There are many others who I have met said, you know, we can only believe in what we can see and experience. And so all that stuff about life after death is Baba Misa, it's fiction, it's fantasy, it makes us feel good, but there's no basis for that whatsoever. So here you have someone who's scientist who believes otherwise in the reality based upon science, that you cannot really destroy that which exists. What is the movie that was made about 1/60th of a? We know that when a human being dies, there's, I think it's 1/69th or 1/60th of us that cannot be measured, cannot be quantified after one dies. And there was a movie made about that. And somehow this is proof that there's continuity after death. I leave that with you. One of the ground rules as far as Jewish appreciation in the afterlife, and I've shared this story before. I'll go back before I continue. I'll never forget, I visited a fellow named Ed Levy. I remember his name. This goes way back when I was a student rabbi in New Jersey, when I was still a student at seminary. And in this community where I was at in New Jersey, there was a very well-known multiple sclerosis hospital for those who were very ill. And I remember visiting, Ed Levy was a patient there. And he asked me about afterlife because he was in the kind of the final days. And we discussed in brief the things I'm sharing with you. And I'll never forget his roommate chimed in and said, I don't know how you Jews do it. I'm a Christian and I know for certain I'm going to heaven because of my beliefs. I don't know how you do it. It's your religion I could have nothing to do with because I need to know where I'm going after I die. And I'll never forget that conversation. You know, some things, as Rabbi Ed knows, really stick with you when you're a rabbi. I'll never forget that comment made. And the way I understood that, though, and I hope you can appreciate at the end of my remarks here, is that there's great wisdom in Judaism's approach to this, not having certainty about what happens after we die. There is no catechism in Judaism. There's no doctrine of belief in afterlife. I've never heard a rabbi said to anybody, if you don't believe in afterlife, you're karet, you're cut out of the Jewish people. But I have heard that from people who are Muslim and Christian, that if they dare even ponder that possibility, that is a great violation of the basic tenets of those two monotheistic faiths, because Judaism has no doctrine. It has a variety of beliefs. As always in Judaism, anything that is faith-oriented, belief-oriented, philosophy, thought, messianic beliefs, whatever the God beliefs, are all a matter of discussion and contemplation. Judaism is a behavioristic religion. You want to know how to give tzedakah to those in need? I can open up the Hilchot Tzedakah in Mishnah Brura or in the Rambam Mishnah Torah, and I could spell out exactly what we're supposed to do. Same with the way that we celebrate our holidays, our Shabbat, the way that we mourn. Judaism's dictates in terms of behavior. There's a system by which our halakha, our Jewish law, can grow and develop and evolve, but the discussions about what we're supposed to do are predominant in Jewish life, not what we are supposed to believe, which to me is a strength, because we can, my Jewish mind is free to speculate, to challenge, to denounce, to argue against. I can be a faithful Jew and keep the mitzvot, which help build the building bricks to make this world a better place. But I can believe, I can go on that journey of belief any way I want. I can read a Maimonidean text, a Kabbalistic text. I can ponder, I can discuss. And so that which is difficult to ponder is in Jewish tradition, difficult to ponder, and allows us that tremendous freedom. We are a this worldly behavioristic religion. We're supposed to live to the fullest. Death is a reality. In Jewish terms, it's the greatest mystery of all. Another fact that you should all know is that in the entire Torah and in the entire Tanakh, except some very few difficult verses that seem to refer to afterlife, like chapter 37, Ezekiel, a couple verses in Isaiah 28, some references in Daniel to resurrection of the dead. 99.8% of the Hebrew script of the Bible, Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, makes no reference to afterlife at all, none. There are metaphors, there's some reaching into that. My favorite chapter is Ezekiel's chapter 37. But again, it's not doctrine, it's speculation. That's all we have. However, the idea of olam haba, so it's called in our terms, the world to come, not hell. Hell and heaven, those are very Christian terms and became Muslim terms as well. Those are not Jewish terms. In fact, the word for hell, there are a couple of references to Sheol in Hebrew scripture, which is very hard to figure out, something about the underground, but not really defined in the Torah at all. Gehenna in rabbinic texts refer to the valley of Gehinnom in Jerusalem. You can go there today. It's where apparently the Moabites and some of the Canaanites used to throw their children off the cliff because they believed in child sacrifice. That is a Jewish term for Gehenna in this world. There's no such concept of a hell in the next world. It just doesn't exist. And I dare say, if any of you, I know I'm looking at Al here, if any of you have been to Auschwitz, you don't need any other definition of hell on earth. It's been here already. And that is a very Jewish understanding of it. Why do I have to contemplate Dante's hell view of that after I've been to Auschwitz? I know what hell looks like. It's in this world. It's what human beings do to each other. So the idea of a world to come, even though it never became doctrine, but a belief, developed sometime during the Second Temple period, in the latter years of the Second Temple, appears to have been influenced from either, there's different theories about the Zoroastrian, Persian influences, or and some Greek influences about the separation of the body and the soul, which became very popular beginning around the 2nd century before the Common Era, and obviously led to Christianity with its offshoots from which started as a Jewish sect. Those became very popular terms. And the reason for that in particular, it developed in the 1st century before the Common Era to a very heightened degree, is because the rabbis were dealing with the fact that people wanted answers to the question why the righteous were suffering and why the wicked were prospering. It's the old question that we've been delving into in our class on theodicy, and why bad things happen to good people and why good things happen to bad people. And so because of that, the rabbis, because they believed in a just God, the thought process coalesced and developed into the idea that there was a world to come where God would right the ship for the righteous, the tzaddikim, the righteous ones who seem to suffer needlessly in this world. And we leave that up to God. There was no notion of how God was going to do it or what the world would look like in heaven. But there was a notion that there had to be some way that this God of justice and love would reward the righteous and punish the wicked. That's where the Jewish concept of olam haba, of the afterlife, developed from the rabbinic period, Second Temple period, after the biblical period. And there was all kinds of others. I should share one very famous rabbinic source in the Mishnah, Pirkei Avot. It says it's Kol Yisrael Chelek Ba'olam Haba. All of Israel has a portion in the world to come. That Mishnah doesn't find what that world is. It doesn't say anything other than there's a world to come. That's because the rabbis knew that you don't delve into areas that belong to God. There's a great verse, by the way, at the end of Deuteronomy, in Nitzavim, the last verse of the 1st chapter of Nitzavim, Deuteronomy 29 off the top of my head, where it says, Hanistarot Ladonai Eloheinu, V'haniglot B'nei Adam. The secret things belong to God, and the revealed things belong to human beings. I don't know if you ever come across, there's all kinds of little dots above that verse, which makes it even more interesting. It's very mysterious. The secret thing, the things that we don't know belong to God, Things that we do know belong to us. Whenever I read that verse, it reminds me of this whole tension between this world and the next world. We believe in the next world, the rabbis would say, but who are we to define what God does in that next world? And so you have all kinds of, oh, by the way, another thing that Pirkei Avot says is that tzadikei umot ha'olam, yesh lahem chelek ba'olam haba, that the righteous of the non-Jews also have a portion in the world to come. That's another important rabbinic notion. The role of being Jewish was confined to this world. There's no salvation theory. Again, I remember my Mormon roommates when I first started going to college. Rick and Dwayne, I have a hard time forgetting names of people. And they were so Mormon, and they were Mormons. They were so into where the Mormons, different classes of the Mormons go when they die in this planetary system, for the leaders go here and the next group goes there. And they were also so puzzled by the idea that there's no such thing in Jewish thought. However, there's the notion that not only the Mormons go to heaven, but the righteous of all peoples have a place in the world to come. Again, there's no notion of heaven. There's just an idea of continuity, that the righteous somehow need to be rewarded, that the role of being Jewish is limited to this world. There's no, I tell people who choose to become Jewish converts, if you're looking to become Jewish because you want to have a special place after you die, you're in the wrong religion. We don't make that guarantee at all. In fact, there are good people from all kinds of backgrounds, and ours is a very universal religion in that regard. We don't make any distinctions. That is not the case in Christianity, and it's not the case in Islam at all. So you think of how that all developed in the two major religions. If you're not Muslim, I'm sorry, you have, in a sense, rejected God. And this was made very clear when I was in London by an Imam Stubla. In Muslim belief, everyone is born a Muslim. So if your parents raise you differently, either as a Jew or a Christian or a Buddha, whatever you are, you have, in a sense, rejected God. There's no notion of conversion in Islam. So if you choose to become a Muslim, you're basically going back to the way you're supposed to be when you were born. And that's good in their view, because to be a Muslim means that you have a special place after you die. The same in Christianity. If you have faith in Jesus as your Messiah, you are saved. And if you don't, you are not. Now, that doesn't mean all Christians buy into that fundamental doctrine, but it's pretty hard to read Christian scripture and not come away with that very clear view that developed with Paul and then with the early church fathers, that if you're Jewish and you reject the correct faith, you are finished. I've mentioned this before, I'll mention it again. I had a debate many years ago when I was in Connecticut, very young rabbi, and we had an adult education program in the community, and we were debating, I don't remember the exact subject, but this issue came up and the differences between Judaism and Christianity. And I challenged the Christian minister who was there. It was a pretty fundamentalist person. And I said, it's very hard from a Jewish perspective to contemplate that a fellow like Adolf Eichmann, who was responsible for murdering about 4.5 million Jews, who has still never been excommunicated from the Catholic Church, still, by the way, has not, would be saved. And yet the 99.5% of rabbis, just use the rabbis, forget all the other Jews, who refused to convert to Christianity, who led pretty righteous lives, are doomed to hell. This is impossible for a Jew to contemplate, understand. And of course, his answer to that was, I don't get it either, but I'm not God, and God made the rules. And it was kind of the end of the discussion, because from I mean, what can you discuss? What is there to say? This is a concept of God that is just totally out of bounds from the way I was raised, you were raised, and what we've come to know of a loving and just God to the entire, to all humanity, not just to the Jewish people. So there have been all kinds of views and discussions about this. In the Middle Ages, it was a very important discussion and debate between the philosophers and the Kabbalists and the mystics. Maimonides, even though in his Principles of Jewish Faith, said that belief in Tchiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, is one of the principles of Jewish faith. But in his writings, in the guide, in Moreh Nevuchim, the guide for the perplexed and otherwise, he believed don't expect a bodily resurrection. There's a continuity. What that's referring to is a continuation of the nefesh, of the soul of a person. And that was very important to him as a philosopher. You know, Maimonides' vision of what happens to us after we die is that we're going to sit around a table with all of my dear friends, and we're going to be studying Torah all day long. That was his image of what happens after we die. The Kabbalists had a much more mystical view of what happens after we die. In fact, the Kabbalists dabbled with reincarnation. There were some Kabbalists who felt that we appear again in this life. It wasn't the mainstream view, but was part of the, I think it's even mentioned in the Zohar. And then there was this notion of Gilgul, which was a rabbinic notion, again, that our bodies are circulating underneath, and when the time comes for redemption, we will see bodily resurrection. The bottom line here is that in our tradition, even with all that speculation, it's only speculation. Don't let any rabbi ever tell you that you have to believe a certain thing about what happens when we die. You're allowed to speculate any way you want. You can write poetry, you can write music, you can say this is it. The only thing it says in the Torah, by the way, about Moses is dying and Abraham's dying and Isaac's dying and Jacob's dying, it says Vayasef Elamav, that they're gathered unto their people. Now, you can interpret that in all kinds of ways. That doesn't reject the idea of Olam Haba, but it seems to, based upon the fact that the Torah really doesn't accept any ideas of afterlife, it seems to imply that in the early notions that our lives are recirculated in the lives of those we leave behind. And there was reason for that, by the way. And those of you who've been to my class on Wednesday in particular, we've studied the obsession with afterlife in Egyptian religion. They were obsessed with it. Book of the Dead, mummification, embalming, the elaborate tombs, the pyramids for the dead, the worship of the Nile, going down the Nile to the afterlife. This was all repudiated in the Torah in the earliest parts of our religion. So you guys choose death. The Torah says, "Uvacharta b'chaim," you shall choose life. Death, life, death, life. That's how Judaism developed, and therefore it never developed any coherent or dogmatic view of afterlife. Now, the thing here is, in largely in Jewish tradition, trying to capture the scope of thinking, is that clearly our God does not want us to know what happens to us after we die. And I think and this is a hard exercise, if you're God, why wouldn't you just tell everybody, hey guys, don't worry, you're gonna die and you have a better place to come to, everything will be great, so don't worry. What would be the problem with that? How would people live their lives? Again, story from the Altschuler past, the real one. I was driving to teach my teaching my classes at Chapman University. I was on the highway, a windy road, and I was listening to to NPR, and there was an interview with one of the terrorists of 9/11. This was about 2005, 2006, somewhere in there. And they interviewed this fellow who had not been captured, but he was part of the planning of 9/11. He was being interviewed from somewhere in the Arab world. We don't know where. He wouldn't give a name, but he had a long interview, and I was listening to this. And one of the there were a lot of horrible things in that interview, but the part I'll never forget, and I almost went off, you almost lost your rabbi. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, because the questioner asked a good question. He said, 2,900 people plus were murdered in that attack. Do you have any remorse for what you've done? And the terrorist said, no, I don't. And the reason why I don't is because we did those people a favor. They're going to be there. They all of a sudden died as martyrs of Allah, and they're going up to a much better place in heaven. So there's nothing to complain about. We didn't murder them. We did them a service. They're going to a better world. That was almost going off the road for me. When the questioner said, shouldn't you have perhaps given those people the option of whether they wanted to be murdered or not? And he said, no, because we know in our Islamic faith that where they're going. And so therefore there's nothing to discuss. Now, that is a little window into understanding why, in our view, God could not possibly tell us what happens to us after we die. Because look how that poisoned the life that we live, the preciousness of life in the here and now on earth. It would all be destroyed, which in many times in history, that's what religious fanatics tried to do. And by the way, it's not just religion. It's also Trotsky and Lenin when they conducted their civil war against the whites during the Russian Civil War between 1917, 1921, 22, in which Lenin said, in order to really achieve the communist enterprise, you have, in order to make eggs, make omelets, you've got to break a lot of eggs. So you got to kill people in order to get to your goal. That's what fanatics do. And Judaism has this very beautiful way of saying, don't be God. You are not God. Leave some things up to God and live what we're supposed to do in this life, bringing sanctity and righteousness and love and all those good values that we try to promote each and every day. As Ben Sira said, Ben Sira was a Jewish wisdom writer who lived in Jerusalem 2,200 years ago. And I like to quote him when I'm conducting a funeral. He said, we've been shown so much in the land of the living as mortal human beings. How are we supposed to even contemplate what happens to us after we die? And Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel had a great line. And when he was asked there was an interview that he gave, and I used to have it, I don't think I have it anymore. He was interviewed, remember Carl Stern with ABC News? He was a very good journalist, and he had a long interview with Abraham Joshua Heschel. It's worth trying to listen to. I'm sure YouTube has it somewhere. And he was asked, did you believe about it in afterlife? And Heschel said, I leave what's up to God to God. My goal, my role here is to try to bring godliness, God to this earth and this life. And he said, we Jews do believe in another world. It's just that we take our worlds one at a time. Great quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel. So there's no use for, in fact, there can be danger in our view of having a specific belief in afterlife, either as a crutch or to scare us based upon belief rather than deed. There are plenty of admonitions in the Torah. Don't be idolaters. You better take care of the poor. You better take care of the needy. a lot of admonitions, but never in our Torah would it say, you better do the right thing, otherwise you're not going to have a place in the world to come. And that doesn't appear in rabbinic literature at all. A vague notion about God rewarding the just and punishing the wicked. That's all our texts say about that. So there are various Jewish views, and I just want to kind of mention some of them. There are some Jewish views. My dear colleague and friend, Rabbi Richard Rubenstein, who wrote a great book called After Auschwitz, he struggled with God belief. He just died, by the way, a few months ago. I think it was about 95, 96 years old. And we were in touch all the time. Very interesting individual, brilliant. And his view was, and he was a very observant Jew. He just said, we die. We live on in our families, in memory of the things that we do to change this world. That was his view. And he was a great rabbi, very thoughtful, very sensitive. There's a view of Maimonides that says that the soul in some way returns to God who gave it. There is, I would say in general, that there is a notion in this, we are rabbinic Jews, that there is reward for good, that evil must be punished, and somehow God in his wise ways works that out. We can't know that because we're human beings, but somehow that'll be worked out in the future. Again, there were mystical views in reincarnation, in bodily resurrection, which was very popular during the period of the Second Temple, and of course in the early Jewish sect called Christians, who didn't call themselves Christians, by the way, until the 4th and 5th centuries. That's a different story. The common thread of all these views, differing views in Judaism, is that God lives in us and cares for us when we die. He mourns with us. He's with us. He fills in our dark places. We are the agents of God. We act as God's agents in comforting those who suffer at a time of death and loss. And the beauty of Judaism, again, to emphasize, is that those are notions, faith notions, but they are not absolutes, no catechism. They are speculation only. And we, by the way, we find some references to resurrection of the dead in the Yigdal, which is kind of a paraphrased edition of Maimonides' 13 Principles of Jewish Faith. The third blessing in every Amidah, Mechayeh HaMetim, we bring life to the dead, which can be translated in different ways. If you open up a Reform prayer book, by the way, they have changed I don't remember the wording, but they've changed the wording of that third blessing because they reject the notion of the resurrection of the dead. I don't believe in changing texts. I recognize that that text was probably written before the Second Temple was destroyed, and we can come up with different interpretations, but I think that it's the idea that the dead live on either in us or in some way is a very important general belief of ours. The belief, this is interesting. I'm about to finish, but a couple things. The belief in afterlife was so great at the time of the Second Temple that the Josephus gives us an account that he was so worried about the Jewish notion of the resurrection of the dead that he had units of his army guarding the Jewish cemeteries in case they rose from the graves and started fighting the Romans. So it shows you how prevalent and how strong was the early belief in the resurrection of the dead during that period. And this, by the way, notion of resurrection became very important in the Dead Sea sect, which had a great influence in the early Christianity and the resurrection of God dying and resurrected. Those were all bandied about at that time. We say in the second blessing, when we come to the Torah, V'chayei olam natah b'tochenu, God has planted eternal life in our souls. Again, that blessing has been reworked by the pragmatists, if you will. I don't believe it. I'm not sure what the Reform does, but I know that Mordechai Kaplan, the rational thinker who opposed Heschel, the mystic and Chassid in so many ways, believed in rewording that particular blessing. And I don't have the rest of the reconstruction of Siddur in front of me, but I know that they changed the wording of that as well. In the El Malei Rachamim refers to the return to Gan Eden. That this was written in the Middle Ages when that belief in afterlife was extremely strong. Again, not specified, but a belief in afterlife. The Gan Eden Te Menuchatam, as it says in the El Malei Rachamim, and in our Yizkor services when we remember our loved ones, there is the notion again of afterlife. There are very few references. Well, let me go on. We have 3 minutes. I'm going to skip that. There's a Talmudic source about from Rav and then Rambam Koning, but I want to leave with you with the following questions, and we'll take questions from you. Maybe you'll ask me these, and we can certainly discuss them. But I think the questions for us that still remain on the table would be, is there a connection between this life and the next? Do you believe in Olam Haba, in the world to come? How are Jewish beliefs different from Muslim and Christian beliefs? Shall we or do we still believe in resurrection of the body? Does the soul live on in some way? Do the dead communicate with us, with the living? In what way? And then there's a whole research about near-death experiences. I'm not an expert in that area, but what was her name? Kubler-Ross, I forgot her first name. She devoted her entire life to measuring people who've had near-death experiences. And in every case, at least according to her studies, in every case, people who have been basically pronounced dead, they're not really dead because they come back, but in those cases, in her view, they are clinically dead. They've all had a very wonderful experience of light and the notion of going somewhere. Like the rabbis say that this life is a prose door, an entryway to the world to come. I don't know. And I'm not a scientist in her view. She studied that for years and believes that very strongly in her work. Why the issue I raised, I think there's good reason why God in our tradition emphasized this world's behavior, because these beliefs in afterlife or perfection in ideology have led to nothing but death and destruction. Why God would not want us to know explicitly about the afterlife. I love the Jewish notion that afterlife applies to everybody. You don't have to be Jewish in our idea that God loves all humanity. There's no notion of being Jewish secures for us any special place in Olam Haba. That's a good thing. It's a good thing. Zochreinu l'chaim, uv'charta b'chaim. Our tradition says, deal with what we know. We've been shown everything. Sanctify this life and leave the rest to God. It was Rabbi Meir, I'm finishing up now. Rabbi Meir in the 2nd century said, without death, there is no life, which means that death teaches us to value and cherish everything that we have. He said quoted in the Agadah of the Gemara, God saw that all he had made, this is from Breshit, from Genesis, and it was Tov Ma'od, it was very good. And Rabbi Meir said, including death. Knowing that our lives are limited is a good thing, and not knowing where we go is a good thing, because it drives us to seek more and more and more life. I'll never forget, I did a wedding some years ago, and it was one of the fathers, I don't know, the father of the groom or the bride, said to me, Rabbi, I'm so happy right now. My kids are all here. My youngest is getting married. If I were to die tomorrow, I'm the happiest man in the world. I've been shown everything here. I am a very, very happy man. And certainly mortality makes us aware of how precious our blessings are. And that's the ultimate gift. If not for death, our lives really would be meaningless, endless, wouldn't go anywhere. And that's why the psalmist says, Limot Yamenu, count your days every single day so that you may acquire a chokhmat lev, a heart of wisdom. That is, in sum, the Jewish view of all of this. I think we're right at the time for questions. Do we have some?
Yes, we do, Rabbi. I'm gonna. I don't know how. An echo here, Rabbi. I'm going to blend a couple together. One of which you kind of touched upon last week during Jerry Ronkin's presentation, and it has to do with cremation. I'm sure that you knew this was going to come up. I'm sure you've done this before. In the event of, let's say there is an afterlife of some sort or another, does Jewish law specifically say something that cremation somehow is a roadblock to entering that door, number one? And this, I believe, is from your friend Claire, who I believe is in England.
Oh, is she with us? Wow. It's late there.
We've set a Mishnah Beirach for the Queen, so she's the Queen's all set. Not to worry, Claire.
I don't do that anymore. Oh, that's well. She's. I don't. I used to read the prayer for the country. It was a prayer for the Queen and the royal family. Claire, don't tell anybody. I don't do that here.
That was just a poor attempt, my attempt to bring a little levity to this conversation. So I'll read this from Claire, along with the question from before about cremation being a roadblock. From Claire, is not the tradition of burying rather than cremating based upon the idea of resurrection of the body, the basis why amputated limbs or body parts after a bombing missile attack are collected in Israel? So could you touch upon that and bring that together for us?
That's Claire always asks good questions. Try to stump the rabbi. But I've heard that before, and I'm sure that there are some authorities who probably would say that that's the reason why we should be opposed to cremation. I take the view that Jewish law's opposition to cremation is based upon simply respecting the physical being of a human being and not destroying that. To cherish it, the earthly remains of a dear one, it's called kvod hamet, or just respect the deceased. And last week I did touch upon what happens during a cremation. It's a very grisly process, and it's not respectful of the deceased. If you have the notion, Claire, that there is bodily resurrection of the dead, which again, that was popular at a certain time. Maimonides certainly didn't like that idea. Then I suppose you could make a case that cremation would interfere with an appropriate resurrection of the body. But I think that we've grown beyond that. And the reason why we dislike cremation, reject it, it's prohibited by Jewish law, is because it's not respectful. It's not kvod hamet. It's not respectful to the deceased. It has nothing to do with resurrection of the dead. I don't think that God is so limited that he has to piece back together the earthly. And what do you do with earthly remains that have been, as brought up in the Talmud, devoured by a wolf, in which there are no remains anymore? Or what do you do with the Jews who were gassed and then cremated by the Nazis? They don't have resurrection in the world to come. My notion of God could not possibly be limited to a bodily resurrection. So when we bury an arm or a leg or a limb that's been torn away, it's merely out of respect. Who are we to, take a bodily part? And Jewish law is so sensitive to desecrating the physical remains that even after a circumcision, which is a very small thing, we are supposed to bury the foreskin. We don't just throw it away. We bury the foreskin. It doesn't have to be buried in any burial plot, but buried under the ground, which is, to me, I find very sensitive and very moving. That this was, the idea, this was all given by God. So we have to protect it. And even though we don't, we certainly don't revere the bodily remains after someone leaves, nevertheless, it was part of what God gave to the world. And so be respectful, honor the deceased. Don't just throw them away. As I mentioned last week about cremation, a Jew who cremates after the Shoah, after how the Nazis were trying to get rid of the bodies as quickly as possible. That's not a Jewish way. Everyone's deserving of a burial. Eichmann was, I don't know what they did to Eichmann. He was the only one who didn't have an appropriate burial in Israel because capital punishment is prohibited in Israel. But Eichmann was executed. I don't know what they did to his body. I know they were pleading for him to be buried or whatever, but that's a very exceptional case. We respect the remains of a human being. Good question.
Before I open the questions up to the floor, which there is one from Murray, there's another question on the Zoom chat, and it goes like this, Rabbi. Would the arrival of the Messiah change any of the concepts you discussed tonight?
Well, that's a good one too. Again, I know that was very popular in early rabbinic Second Temple text, the idea that messianic deliverance, and that's another whole subject because there's so many different views of the Messiah, of the Mashiach in Jewish life. An era in the prophets, individual like Moses in the later prophets, and then the rabbis developed the notion of a Davidic Moses type of figure who would save all humanity, and then a Joseph figure who would rule over humanity. So many different speculative texts on messianism. It would be interesting to study those 10 or 12 pages in the Talmud and the Tractate of Sanhedrin. So there's no specific doctrine of Messiah, let alone what happens when the Messiah comes. There are rabbinic texts, there's all kinds of midrashes, there's all these speculative things. But you're free to think anything you want about what happens when the Mashiach or when the Messianic age comes, because there's no definitive Jewish doctrine there. Again, all those faith matters are, and I love, I'm reading Elie Wiesel's memoirs right now. I love his Midrash, and he almost has a mystical soul. I'm enjoying it so much, but it's not the all of Judaism because the only matters of Jewish law that are law are what I'm supposed to do, not what I'm supposed to think. So I leave that up to you. It's a nice notion, the idea that the mystics and the rabbis came up with, that when there's messianic deliverance, there'll be a resurrection of the dead and all that. But that's not doctrine. It cannot possibly be doctrine. And those notions are changing all the time. So read Kaplan and Buber and Heschel and Rosenzweig and just the full gamut of Jewish philosophy and thought. And you'll get more confused than ever because everybody's got different ideas about what happens when we're delivered from the woes of this world. And that's what I love about Judaism, by Jewish thought. I can think anything I want. I can write poetry, music, and it's all good. It's not right and it's not wrong. And it allows us a great deal of freedom. People who are Christian and Muslims don't have that freedom, period, which I love about who we are. Genius of the rabbis.
Excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt. Rabbi, I'm going to ask Cantor Simon to post his question, and then we'll wrap it up with a question from Rabbi Ed. So Cantor Simon, please unmute yourself if you would and fire away.
Which I have done.
Murray, Tanner Murray, my dear
Thank
friend.
you so much. This was so, shall I say, a life giving. So first of all, the phrase in the Reform prayer book is Mechaye HaKol, which is to quicken all, to bring all to life. That's what they have substituted for Mechaye Metim.
I knew they made some change. I wasn't.
Well, you can make of that anything you would like.
Right.
So number two, organ donors. This was another issue that people were uncomfortable with because of the Mechaye Metim concept, giving a heart, a liver, a kidney, that when they were resurrected, they would be minus that organ. And again, that is not part of our concept of resurrection. But here's what I wanted to speak about. In the Torah blessing, Nata b'tocheinu chayei olam, I used to tell my bar mitzvah kiddies, you have implanted within us eternal life does not mean that we will live forever. It means that you are subscribing to eternal values and eternal teachings of the Torah. So by accepting the Torah, you're accepting that part of eternity, which our people consider to be the teachings and the values of the Torah. And they bought that concept. And I think that's a good way of putting it.
I was just going to say, I'm signing up for Cantor Simon's bar mitzvah tutoring. I love it. That is a completely beautiful, valid way of interpreting that. But you have to understand that the Satmar Hasidim don't mess with that. That's the direct beeline to Olam Haba. So they just interpret it very literally. But that's it. That's welcome to the Jewish world.
Yes. Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you, Cantor Simon. Thank you. Thanks so
I
much.
think we'll close with, and I will grant executive privilege to Rabbi Ed to ask his question, and then ask Rabbi Ed to say a few words, and then turn it over to our illustrious president, Dr. Eric Ferber, to make some closing remarks. So with that, before I close out, I just want to thank everybody for making this the easiest Zoom I've ever done, because everybody remained muted throughout the entire presentation. I didn't have to go patrolling around and muting this one and going on the Zoom, but everybody made it great. So I just want to thank everybody for making my job easy. With that, I will clam up, turn it over to Rabbi Ed, and then who will then turn it over to our president. Thank you, everybody, for your time today.
Thank you, Marshall.
Thanks very much, Marshall. One interpretation I have that really prompted in his comment about Mechaye Metim, we praise God who revives the dead, is that when I pray that, second paragraph of the Amidah on Shabbos, for example, for me it means I'm talking about myself. I thank God for waking me up, for bringing me back to a fuller spiritual life, a more contemplative life, being literally more fully aware, which I think is part of the function of praying anyhow. Having said that, the question I want to ask Rabbi Altshuler, my good colleague.
I'm so blessed. We have 4 rabbis in the congregation I know of. I know two chazanim.
We're outnumbered by the cantors, bless them, I'll tell you.
Yeah, we outnumber the cantors. That's okay.
Right.
We are blessed.
But the question I want to ask you seriously is, a lot of us feel that the soul somehow persists after life. Would you care to comment?
Well, I happen to believe that. I mean, now you're asking my personal views. I have a rabbinic faith that there's somehow a God who will, because it's very hard for me to contemplate a world in which so many evildoers get away with what they do, and so much suffering of the innocent children, righteous, especially after the Shoah. I have a faith. Maybe it's a hope, but I have a faith that somehow this God is mindful of all that, and there is a continuity of the soul, or whatever way. Again, I refuse to get into trying to even think about that, because I'm so busy trying to do what I have to do in this life. I agree with Heschel, but I do believe in Olam Haba. I believe that's one of the reasons why we recite the Kaddish at the gravesite before we leave the gravesite and go home, and that is to affirm our gratitude to God for life, and our gratitude for our belief in Olam Haba, and our gratitude for being able to go home and begin the process of fulfilling the mitzvot again. So I do have that own personal view. I certainly don't have all the answers there. It is a faith, it's a belief I have. I don't really spend much time dwelling on that. I agree with you, my dear colleague, Ed, that when I recite Mechayim Eitim, all kinds of images come my way about life, about this idea that I need. Oh, by the way, another important factor here is we need to continue to find ways of keeping the lives of our dear ones who have passed on alive. They have to be alive. They have to be alive in everything I do, we do. I'm a very strong believer in that. And when I think of Mechayim Eitim, I always think of my dear father, my grandparents, and all those wonderful people that unfortunately have passed from this world. So all these interpretations are wonderful, and we can spend all night talking about how these particular references, B'tochenu and Mechayim Eitim, how all these references have given us strength. That's why I don't believe in changing the words of the text.
On behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you, Rabbi Altschuler, for another outstanding presentation. It was really superb. You continue to amaze us, you continue to educate us, and it just gets better all the time. So we really thank you.
Thank you.
I think tonight's topic was really a very intriguing one, and something that most of us have pondered about. So it really was a very interesting topic. Thank you, Rabbi Altschuler, for comparing it with other religions so we can see other points of view. And you also mentioned Rabbi Heschel's brilliant quotation, which I think is well worth remembering. So tonight was certainly another outstanding presentation, and we wish you, Rabbi Altschuler, continued success. Look forward to further presentations. And once again, thank you all for attending tonight. This really was fantastic. And our continuing education and programs just get better all the time. So join us all for this coming season.
You give me tremendous strength. I'm so happy to be with all of you, and I'll be back in the teaching mode tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. We have another great session tomorrow. Thank you so much, Dr. Ferber, and everybody for being here. Really was a gift.